A very good morning to everybody. Welcome to our Board Connect Forum and Conflict of Interest and my board, Real or Perceived, jointly brought to you by Center for Nonprofit Leadership and Charities Unit. My name is Stacey Low. I'm from Center for Nonprofit Leadership, a part of the National Volunteer and Philanthropy Center. Conflict of interest arises when an individual's personal interests potentially compromise his or her judgment, decisions or actions in the organization. The consequences will adversely affect the individual's duty of care or to the organization. As conflict of interest can be a major source of concern for the governance of charities, it is critical to understand and manage conflict of interest well so that our charities can remain transparent and accountable to the public. The objective of this forum is to share with you how your charities can identify, determine, and effectively manage conflicts of interest. We hope to achieve this through providing various examples and scenarios of conflicts of interest, which can be real, highlight some of the risks caused by failure in managing conflicts of interest issues, discuss the governance and disclosure requirements in situation of conflict of interest, and what could charities do to put in place a conflict of interest policy. Before we continue further, I would like to request attention to some of the administrative matters. Attendees' mics are muted during this forum. For better interaction, we encourage all attendees to leave your videos on. Please use the chat function to comment or post questions. The presentation deck will be shared via email after the forum. Kindly note that this session will be recorded. We'll be taking a group photo towards the end of the session, and we'll inform you and post to pose and smile. I shall now invite Professor Hoyuki, Council Member of the Charity Council, to deliver his presentation. Professor Ho is a Professor of Accounting, Associate Prevost Skills Future, and concurrently Cluster Director, Design and Specialized Businesses of the Singapore Institute of Technology. He is also a director of the listed insurance company and serves on the boards of National Kidney Foundation, St. Luke's Elder Care, Prisons Fellowship Singapore, amongst others. He also serves on the Advisory Council of the Institute of Certified Management Accountants, Sri Lanka, Deakin University Integrated Reporting Centre, Australia, and Council of CPA Australia, Singapore Division. Over to you, Prof. Ho.
Thank you very much. All right, let me share screen and set up all the parameters. All right. Good morning to all of you. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to share with all of you. I saw from the video there are many familiar faces. All right. So don't be surprised. I've set my alarm at 11 o'clock. This is when I hand the time back to the to Stacey. Right, as a professor, you know I can go on and on and on and on and long-winded as it is. So I set the alarm to remind me that time's up. All right, I should wrap up as soon as possible. Right. So given today's topic, my agenda will be to set the stage to do a reality check. All right, concerning conflict of interest. One of the important things I hope to cover will be what is a conflict of interest, right? So this is needed because if we don't have an aligned understanding of conflict of interest, we can be looking at the same elephant, but like as blind men touching different parts of the elephant. Then I look at the consequences of ignoring COI in charities and how to deal with COI, and then I give you some food for thought. Right, as we start the day, let me do a poll, right? Do a reality check with a preliminary understanding. So the thought pattern here is Kathy is the founder and owner of a stationery wholesale business, and she's a board member of Do Good Charity. Scenario A, Kathy sold DG knowing that the price is slightly above the market value and direct management of the company. All right, maybe you can launch the poll 1 for question scenario A, please. Thank you. Coming in, very good. All right. Oh, that's interesting. There are individuals say no. All right, good. 6% of the individuals are saying no. Respondents. About 4% say not sure, 10% now, no. 83% yes. All right, very good. All right, let me give you 2 more seconds, or 5 more seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, okay, so let me continue as you choose to do polling. All right, in this instance, it is relatively clear, all right, that Katie seems to be benefiting or is benefiting from his relationship with the charity, right, by directing management to buy from her company at a slightly higher market value. It could be the fact that she provides better value for service or personalized service whatsoever. But immediately, if you are a third party seeing this and coming to know that Katie is doing this for a charity, I suspect that there will be a kind of righteous indignation, that Katie is benefiting from her role in the charity, right? So in a sense, scenario A seems to be quite clear cut. Let us try the poll in scenario B. Let's try scenario B. Katie sold goods to the charity at cost, which is below the lowest quote from other suppliers. Is this a COA? So remember, the previous question was 81% yes, all right? Okay, 5 more seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Right. So herein lies the interesting things about COI as it is, right? 71% basically say yes, which is slightly less, about 10 percentage point less than the previous questions. So in this session, these are some of the things that we will try to unravel and have a better understanding. What constitutes a COI as it is? Must it always include a financial benefit? And what about optics? What about accountability? So what if we have a COI? Is a COI part and parcel of reality of life? Right. So allow me to move on as it is, right? Okay, let me deal with the next item. So okay, one of the reality check that we have to deal with based on the 6 degrees of separation. They call the 6 handshakes rule. So Singapore is a very small country, right? And the theory says that individuals on average are 6 or fewer social connection away from each other. Therefore, in Singapore, it is very unlikely that in a charity you will come across individuals that's totally not connected to you, right? Very unlikely. That means somehow, somewhere, the board members will know the vendors, or to know some of the suppliers, or to know some of the people in which they transact business with. So this is a reality that we have to deal with. Another reality check that we have to deal with is ethical people make unethical choices. All right, this was a very good quote from one of the articles which I'll be giving to you at the end of this presentation. Serena Vash is a former US federal prosecutor and litigator. And she said, when I first began prosecuting corruption, I expected to walk into rooms and find the vilest people. I was shocked to find ordinary good people I could well have coffee with that morning. And they were still good people who made horrible and terrible choices. So these are some of the pains that we have to deal with in terms of charity. I need to put on record that for all of you who are serving in charities, I want to thank you so much for finding time, using your time, your expertise, your efforts to serve on charity, which are non-paid in many ways, right? And more important than that, you take on the responsibility in which if something happens to the charity, that could tarnish your reputation. Actually, in today's world, serving in charity is very dangerous, right? And for all your efforts, I cannot thank you enough for all the good works you are doing. But herein also lies the challenge in the sense that ethical or good people can sometimes make either unethical choices or horrible choices as it is. What are some of the possible reasons? In the world of fraud, the fraud triangle provides us with explanations concerning people think that they can rationalize their way and they can get away with it. There were opportunities involved, all right? And there were a pressure for them to benefit from their fraud or bad choices. It could also be the organizational setting, a lack of focus on ethics and compliance, a poor example from leadership. And later on, I'm going to introduce you this thought pattern called moral equilibrium, moral compensation, moral licensing. But I'd like to suggest that a large part of COI are also due to carelessness or due to the lack of knowledge where people don't deem it as a COI and say, so what's the problem, right? The charity did not suffer any losses. In fact, they get a better deal. Why should this be a problem? So this gives us a good introduction to, we need to have a common understanding concerning what is the definition of COI. COI is defined as a situation where a board member, staff, or other person with an existing or potential financial or other material interest that might impair his or her independence or objectivity in the discharge of responsibilities and duties to a charity. All right. Someone suggested that this is written by a lawyer. Right. So that's the reason why we have difficulty understanding it. But never mind. Let me strip it down to 3 key attributes in a COI. Number 1, the person that's involved in COI must have a role and responsibility. In other words, he must have the ability to a certain extent to influence the ultimate decisions. Number 2, he's put in a situation where he has a conflict. Either his personal interest is conflicted, or there are interests in which the charities that he's working at may not be given the best value, right? The best interest is gathered. And thirdly, in having the responsibility and a conflicting situation, there's an impairment of independence or objectivity. Here are some of the considerations that we need to deal with. Only confined to financial losses and gains. This is a very narrow description. Later on, I'll show you even the perception of financial gains and losses or gains, especially in the party, can create different sets of damages. All right. And then we ask a question, what amounts of material interest? Is it all amount? And whether we have to deal with potential or even perceived conflict. And can COI be eradicated? So let us look at what the Code of Governance actually covers for us. The Code of Governance makes it very clear that board members and staff should act in the best interest of the charity. So this is the dominant principle, that whatever you do, you are to be acting in the best interest of the charity. You don't have to be in the charity. If you do, it is your responsibility to act in the best interest of the charity. And it seems that there is a given understanding that conflict of interest will arise. There must be clear policies and procedures should be set and measured, be taken to declare, prevent, and address conflict of interest. So let me put it in the unambiguous manner. Conflict of interest in most circumstances are not illegal. They are not forbidden. They are not such that they are evil under the sun, right? There will be occasions of conflict of interest because of the 6th degree of separation that many of us struggle with as it is. But what the Code of Governance basically says that you must have clear policies, right, that is being set and understood, and there are measures that can be taken to declare, prevent, and address interests. So that means they can be addressed.
Yeah, hi, Adelina.
In that sense, to live with the reality of the conflict of interest. So under the definition of conflict of interest, the unfortunate problem is that we can have 2 very oddly opposite extremes. On a very narrow definition, all right, we only confine conflict of interest to financial and material gains, right? If there's no financial, no material gains, it's not COI as it is, all right? And then the other extreme will be anything which is remotely connected to a relationship is a conflict of interest. So under those circumstances, you realize that if you're not careful, board members among themselves can quarrel, board members can quarrel with management, and a storm, it can be a storm in the teacup, and it could also be an elephant in the room, in such that we are not recognizing it. So there is a need for clear understanding of what is a COI and to have clear policies and procedures. And this is what I seek to do in the subsequent slides. Some key considerations in a conflict of interest, all right, there is a need to think about some of these key issues, a duty of loyalty, right? As I mentioned earlier, we are volunteers. We don't have to volunteer in a charity. The moment you volunteer in a charity, you are no longer so volunteer. Right? You're bound by the entire code of ethics and conduct as a volunteer. You have to deal with real, potential, and perceived COI. Later on, I'll show you. Even if you have a perceived conflict of interest, that can tarnish your reputation, because a lie repeated 1,000 times becomes truth, particularly in the social media. Don't forget too, if I'm not careful in handling conflict of interest, it will erode trust and integrity in the charity, right? So let's assume there's a rumor that says items donated to the charity, for example, Yan Wo, or brand's essence of chicken, they were consumed by the staff rather than the beneficiary, right? So this is not merely a conflict, it is almost like theft as it is. Even though this is not true, but if the individuals felt that the board members or the staff has been taking some of these benefits away, it erodes the trust and integrity. That alone is as bad as actual taking of the goods itself. Right? Your reputation, the morale of the staff when they look and say, yeah, we always can allow to buy goods from our board members. That alone, the tone from the top is eroded and the morale of the staff fell. And don't forget, in today's world, whistleblowing and social media will do you untold damages. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your greatest nightmare. I have simulated a Facebook and an Instagram. This will be your nightmare, because if you're a board member sitting on this charity and this pops up in the Facebook and it's shared 1,000 times, you can be sure, and you have to pray hard, that your photograph don't appear on the Straits Times. No. Another charity in trouble as it is. The reputational damages to a charity are enormous under those circumstances. Right. So here are some of the general categories of conflict of interest. In the poll that we have, we move from the black to the gray, right? There's a direct financial gain or benefit to the member in the scenario A. But in scenario B onwards, and not so clear, there's an indirect financial gain or benefit to friends or relatives or member, or non-financial gains or benefit to friends or relatives or member, and conflict of interest. So one of the things I constantly face with is this. You see, many of the board members are well connected, and I like to believe many of them are actually well intended, right? So let's take an example, right? The charity wants to have an investment, set up an investment, right? So the board member say, oh yeah, I have friends, right? Because I work in the financial industry, and then he recommend friends, right? Which is fine. You see, I mean, there may not seem to be a conflict of interest. But when the members start directing that, oh, you can only see this person, and this person will give you the best deal, no need to include any other people, no need beauty contest whatsoever as it is. Immediately, it can create perception of conflict of interest, because the people then ask, does the board member has other business dealings with this particular person or this particular company, such as he or she is just introducing her friend or his friend as it is. And it may not be so innocent after all. You see what I mean, right? So these are the things that can create challenges. And the last of the lot is a conflict of loyalty. All right. Do you benefit indirectly? Is introducing your nephew to work in the charity a conflict as by itself? Right? And so on and so forth. So the consequences of conflict of interest in the article by McDonald and Norman in 2002, a front runner in terms of some of the articulations of the conflict of interest. I really like some of the statements he says. And he says here, it may well be that the consequences of an actual or perceived conflict of interest are much more serious for many not-for-profit organizations than any other types of organization. The second bullet point is, all the world loves to hate the hypocrite. Who is the hypocrite? When people appear to be enriching themselves behind the veil of self-sacrifice and charity, the righteous indignation flows. And this can happen even when there's no actual hypocrisy, corruption, or abuse of trust, but only the appearance thereof. And then he concludes the article by saying, the loss of public trust in the organization, whether justified or not, could be devastating. right? For example, you take the case of one of the nightmares that we have was for NKF. They had to do so much damage control, right? When the incident hit the press as it is, right? So these are things in which you and I as board members would never ever want to dabble with, right? So this is where we want to really have a very clear understanding of what is a COI. Let me do a quick detour. This is an accounting detour. Other than COI, in the accounting standard 24, there is a related party transactions. And there's very clear description that whenever you transact with a related party as defined by a person or an entity, you have to disclose the transaction, particularly the quantity and the amount. So let me give you an example. This is the extracted financial statement of a charity, right? And under the related parties transactions, that's disclosed in the financial statement, the red part is highlighted very clearly. Compensation paid to close family members of key management personnel of the company, $468,000. This is where I want to emphasize very clearly. COI, by definitions, are not illegal transactions and activities. It doesn't mean that for COI, it is absolutely no. If the family member is the best person to be employed for that particular position, so be it too. But then you need to have a process to explain until the cow come home. All right, you have to have a process such that a third party look at it and say, yes, so and so is the best person, or yes, this related party transaction primarily is justified. You see, the accounting treatment doesn't rule whether the related party transaction is good or bad, appropriate or inappropriate. The accounting treatment always emphasizes transparency and disclosure. They leave it to the readers of the financial statement to raise questions or to do further investigation. It only put the facts up in front. And maybe this is where we can learn a leaf from accounting standards, namely transparency, declaration, may be a way of life whenever we deal with conflict of interest. So it defines what is a person or related party, all right, quite substantial in terms of definition, and then what is an entity. I shall not cover these, and I'll leave it to you as governors to learn something about accounting. Look at IFRS 24, and then basically to read this PowerPoint. Now I want to move on to a poll. All right, I'm going to give you 3 scenarios dealing with conflict of interest. Abstention is ideal, but quid pro quo and symbiotic relationships, unfortunately, is part and parcel of the normal business transactions, right? So let us try the poll S1, right? Director X is the director of charity A, and we have S1. Is there a conflict of interest if Director X raises fund for charity A? Can you switch on the poll, please? Thank you. Right, 5 more seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, let me end the poll and show you the results. All right. So in a very interesting manner, all right, you will find that 24% of them say yes, but 70% of you all said no, right? Well, if you ask me, if this is a conflict of interest, then those of us who sit on multiple boards were immediately in trouble. Right? There seems to be a hint that there is a so-called conflict of the loyalty to a charity, because the question like, if you raise money for A, why not B, right? Are you not prejudicing B, particularly when you have a limited number of so-called amount of money? So these are things in which the board has to deal with. I'd like to take a position, all right, that basically I would probably likely say that it's not a conflict of interest and there's no necessity for declaration unless, all right, unless you use the information in charity B to help you to raise funds for charity A. And then there is a breach of what is so-called duty of loyalty in this instance. Okay. All right. Okay, let's look at the second poll, S2. Is there a COI if Director X introduces a donor to charity B only? Okay, all right. So, okay, so this is a poll, right? Again, the dominant logic seems to be very clear. Okay, all right. 5 more seconds for a poll. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, let me end the poll and share the results. See, again, it is also very clear in this instance, right? Some of you who takes a much stricter perspective will require the director basically to declare this as a conflict of interest, while others basically say yes, which is about 75%. So immediately you start to understand, all right, different people has different threshold or different understanding concerning what amounts to a conflict. And therefore, it's very important for a board to be able to articulate this, and all of you come to a common consensus, because if it's not, then there may be quarrels concerning the actions of board members or even the management. Right? Let's try the third one as it is, right? The third poll. All right. Can you try the third question? Is there a conflict of interest if Director X shares charities A donor database with charity B? Right. Okay, 5 more seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, let's end the poll. All right. The good and bad news is this is a trick question. There is not only a so-called conflict of interest, ladies and gentlemen, you have a violation of PDPA, right? Because the donor database, the charity A donor database, where they collect the donors' information, were only meant for charity A. Any transportation or use by charity B, that is a violation of PDPA. All right. So this is more than just a conflict of interest, right? It is illegal as it is for that matter. So as governors, as board members, this is where we want to be very careful. And this is where I also want to explain also for those, when you're employing fundraising staff, you have to be very careful if the fundraising staff do not take the donor database of the previous charity and port it into your current charity. If you do so, you may have different legal challenges as it is and difficulties going forward. So just be very careful. Just be very careful. Okay, right. So now I want to deal with the issues. How do we tackle conflict of interest? Right? How do we tackle conflict of interest? Right. So dealing with conflict of interest, you must understand the main purpose of the conflict of interest policy primarily is to safeguard stakeholders' trust and confidence. In other words, we are not saying that there should be zero conflict of interest. We are basically saying is that the way we handle the conflict of interest will allow basically the trust and the confidence to be continued in the charity. You see, and this is what Ralph Rode and Packle say in 2009. Despite the ethical minefield that these conflict of interest transactions create, many non-profits oppose restrictions because they rely on insiders to provide donations or goods and services at below market rates. Yet such quid pro quo relationship can jeopardize an organization reputation for fairness and integrity in its financial dealings. To maintain public trust and fiduciary obligations, non-profits need detailed, unambiguous conflict of interest policies, including requirements that employees and boards disclose all financial interests in companies that may engage in transactions with the charity. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to prescribe to you the 4A approach, all right? Many years ago, when I was asked to be audit committee chairman, one of the tasks I was given was to write a conflict of interest policy for a charity, right? So this was my general approach. I used the 4A approach. First key component, the first A, an agreement on the definition of conflict of interest. You see, no matter how imprecise, how inadequate a description of the conflict of interest is, the board members and the management must have a clear understanding and definition of a conflict of interest, preferably with examples, so that individuals can understand, because we have often found that many of the excuses in terms of breach of conflict of interest is the fact, oh, I don't know, I wasn't told, I don't think this is a conflict of interest. And those are very reasonable excuses. An agreement on the definition of conflict of interest remove this layer of argument. And secondly, now that you agree, I want you to acknowledge your duty to disclose any conflict of interest. You say, again, members may say, oh, I know conflict of interest, but you never tell me to disclose. You never tell me what is a procedure when I encounter this particular instance, right? So individual must sign and acknowledges that he understands his duty to disclose, and he will abide by the COI policy. Very clear, simple thought pattern. And then the third piece, which oftentimes is missing from the landscape, is appropriate action or procedure to deal with the declared conflict of interest. Declaration of conflict of interest is imperative. Thereafter, individual and charity need to take appropriate actions and steps to deal with the conflict of interest. There must be a recording, a declaration, and agreed action, whether it's an extension, and all these must be found in your record keeping. And I take a position, whatever that is not written does not count. Right? Or in other words, whatever that's not written concerning the conflict of interest, and the way you deal with it is as good as you didn't deal with the conflict of interest. And let me share with you one common challenges that many charities face is they have annual declaration of conflict of interest. At the end of the year, particularly to satisfy the governance, the checklist, or to satisfy the auditors as it is. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not sufficient. Right? Declaring a conflict of interest doesn't necessitate that you have dealt with it adequately as a board or as a management. So be very clear in your understanding concerning how you deal with a conflict of interest. And let me wrap up in a minute's time. What can we do to increase the compliance of a conflict of interest in charity? Have morally upright and good people, right? Very clear. Set a clear charity ethical reference point, and COI is one of those great areas to start with. Encourage individuals to reflect on the consequences of a COI lapses. In all the training I did for charity, usually I produce a Straits Times first page, with the faces of the leaders on the headline, and say another charity in trouble, right? And if you think and imagine that your face is going to appear there, hopefully that will scare you, yeah, right? And finally, there's an issue about the danger of moral licensing. Moral licensing works in this way. I've done so much for the charity. What's wrong if I take something here or I cut some corners there? Right? Why I'm the founder, or why, I give so much money. So what's wrong if they pay for my entertainment lunch, or they pay for my newspaper subscription, or what have you for that matter? And finally, a food for thought. Ethical leadership is the most critical determinant of organizational culture. Ethical leaders should ask more than, is it legal? But also, is it fair? Is it honest? Is it reputation building? Does it build trust and integrity? Does it encourage my staff as it is? Decision-making process that is transparent and responsive to competing stakeholders' interests will always garner trust and respect. Transparency, openness is a gold standard. And finally, this was well said in the article, no organizational mission statement or ceremonial platitudes can counter the impact of seeing leaders withhold crucial information, play favorites with promotion, stifle dissent, or pursue their own interests at the organization's expense. And it comes back to the statement that was used, all the world hates a hypocrite, especially a hypocrite in a charity. All right, sorry if I use a lot of strong statements. And with this, I will stop and pass it to the panel. Thank you very much for your listening to this seminar.
Thank you,
Prof. Back to you, Stacey. Right.
Thank you, Prof. Ho. Before we actually start the panel discussion shortly, right? There are a couple of questions, in the chats that we might actually is related to your presentation. For example, right, recommended for COI disclosure to be carried annually, and then who do you declare the COI? Is it to the whole board? Yeah. Perhaps you'd like to take on these two questions, Prof, before we go on to the
Okay,
panel
all right.
discussion.
So let me tell you a funny story. You know how young one of the panelists was my chairman, all right, when we were in SATA together. He was my chairman. I was the investment committee chairman. So we have fund managers. And one day a fund manager was my friend. Say, hey, Prof, let's go out for lunch. Let me buy you lunch, as it is. But he's my investment fund manager. So how? So I asked Hao Yao, hey, can I have lunch with my investment fund manager? Hao Yao said, no problem. Go ahead, but don't talk shop. All right. Oh, so I listen. So when I turned out on that day morning, I have a problem because I realized that he was an investment fund manager for two of my charities. I asked permission from one chairman, but I didn't ask permission from the second chairman. So when I turned up for lunch, I would tell you, I said, I'm so embarrassed now. Why don't I buy you lunch? Alternatively, we'll pay our own lunch because I didn't get permission from the other chairman. Right? You may laugh over this as it is, right? But I think you can just imagine the consequences. Prof Ho eat lunch with the fund manager. We don't know what they talk, right? And you could influence the way he managed the fund manager going forward, right? So these are things that we have to be very clear in our thought pattern. And your question, who do you report to? Your charity must have a protocol. Either you report to the AC chair, you report to the chairman, and taking a look at what is the nature of the COI as it is. And then the chairman of the board, like what Hao Yao did, you can eat lunch, no problem. No talking shop. It's a very clear understanding. At least if something happens, I say, yeah, I have chairman's approval. And I keep to my part of the bargain that I don't talk shop. Whether you trust or not, I can't help you on this. But I went through the proper procedure and protocol, and my chairman got my back as it is. Would that help?
Right. Thanks, Prof. So now, right, I see a lot of questions coming in, so we will answer them along the way, hope to answer as many as possible. So I shall now move on to the next segment of the forum, which is the panel discussion. Please join me in welcoming our panelists, Mr. Ang Hao Yao, Mr. Stephen Xia, and Mr. Chi Kok Leong. Mr. Ang Hao Leong is a council member with the Charity Council. Mr. Ang has served in the council sector for over a decade, and it is currently the chairman of Credit Counseling Singapore, a charity that helps individuals and small businesses in debt distress. He also sits on the boards of the Securities Investors Association Singapore, NKF, and the SingHealth Fund. Mr. Stephen Xia serves as a chairperson of the Methodist Church of the Singapore's Council of Governance, among other volunteer work such as providing pro bono legal advice under SAFRA Legal Information Service. A practicing solicitor for 40 years, he co-founded Xia Ong and Partners Limited and facilitates the professional ethics module with the Singapore Institute of Legal Education. Mr. Chi Kok Leong serves as Vice President, High Performance with Volleyball Association of Singapore. Having been in the sport for almost 3 decades, Mr. Chi's involvement evolved from being a national athlete to a coach and now a board member at the association, in charge of setting up high performance and pathway development structures for Team Singapore athletes. He currently holds a full-time job as Vice President, Financial Services in Manulife Financial Advisory, and has been in the financial industry for the past 18 years. I'm glad Prof could join us in the panel, and our participants can continue to hear your good insights. Let me now turn over to our panelists with the questions. The first question is, why having a clear policy or procedure for conflict of interest matters for a charity? I'd like to invite Hao Yao and Stephen for this question. Hao Yao, you first.
Thank you, and good morning. Nice to meet everyone. Thank you, Prof. Ho, for bringing up that incident. Must be almost 10 years ago. I don't really remember it now, but I'm glad I gave you a somewhat sane answer. Well, I think obviously conflict of interest is an important topic. In the Code of Governance for Charities, as Prof. Ho did bring up, it is actually the second section out of 9, so it must be pretty important. It comes after board roles and composition. In summary, it covers basically that charity should have a documented set of procedures for members and staff to declare potential conflicts. So that's pretty straightforward. Staff and board members should not be involved in setting up their own remuneration, and there should be procedures for handling business contracts, contractors, suppliers, and so forth, where there is a potential conflict. And quite clearly, board members should not vote or participate in the transaction, so they should recuse themselves. Importantly, there should be minutes as well, so that all this is documented and not just declared on the spot, you know. And after that, after 10 years, maybe people don't remember what they said anymore. I think importantly, the handling of conflict of interest is to ensure that any transactions where there is a potential or actual conflict of interest is handled in a transparent manner. This is for proper checks and balances and accountability, especially if it is brought up in public, right, in social media and such, that there is properly documented decision making. For my charity that I'm in, you know, Credit Counselling Singapore, I will just highlight a few points rather than go through the whole policy. We have one policy that covers all staff, board members, and volunteers, so we don't differentiate. Everyone's in the same boat where conflict of interest is concerned. Okay, we have also a gift policy or hospitality, in that if you do receive hospitality or gifts for any party, and that includes lunches, it should be declared. If you want to avoid all this, basically, if you do receive gifts, you can, you know, share it with the organization, or, you know, have meetings in the office and such. So keep it pretty official. I mean, ideally, where there is a decision to be made where a board member has interest in, we need a 2/3 majority vote. So this is to recognize that there is a conflict and to ensure that most of the board is behind the decision. So very clear approval process and not very marginal. Aside from declarations and such, I think, as Prof. Ma also mentioned in the code, that it is important that we act in the best interest of the charity. This also means that the charity should not be worse off if there is a potential conflict. I mean, some of these could actually benefit the charities. However, that said, it should be minimized as much as possible, basically to avoid controversy and explaining yourself all the time. But if there is one, to ensure transparency, right, and you have a good answer if this comes out, you know, in the public. One clear example is, for example, a large contract given to a chairman or to his relatives. Now, this is something that, of course, all board members would need to sit up and take note of, and has to be handled well. It may even be a red flag. I'll bring up a few other, you know, areas that perhaps we can cover later in the session or in the Q&A. The conflict of interest also covers areas of remuneration. For example, if board members and employ relatives or even old colleagues or friends. I mean, a lot of this is actually an art, how you handle conflict of interest. We can tell from earlier, it is already not clear what is a conflict of interest given the poll. There are people who say yes and no, and so it's a bit of an art, I think, and not only deciding if it's a conflict, but handling it is a conflict. It's an art. Simple other areas which come up from time to time, board members recommending other board members, you know, relatives is quite obvious a conflict, but how about friends, old colleagues, you know. Also, even simply put, areas where signatories are concerned. Should chairman be signing payments? Should audit committee members be signing payments? I think all these are little conflicts of interest issues that pop up from time to time in all these charities. Perhaps if we have time later, I can cover some of them. Thank you.
Thanks, Hao Yao. Actually, there are a couple of questions. Two of them actually, you know, that's related to what you have just shared. One is, the first one is for a small charity, who should ensure the conflict of interest is done and action has been taken to deal with? Is it the AC chair or compliance manager?
Well, as I said, the areas of conflict are many, many. I suppose if you're talking about the straightforward ones, business contracts with board members and relatives, certainly it's a board issue. Chairman should clearly be on top of things, and chairman should not be conflicted as far as possible, right? So the chairman should avoid having any relationships with other board members or suppliers and contractors and such, so that it can be the final arbiter whenever any of these come up. As Profo mentioned, board members can always ask the chairman for clearance to do certain things. If the chairman is conflicted, then it's going to be very complicated. Some boards use maybe the vice chairman or something, and then as I say, it's more as an art, but clearly no one should be approving their own areas of potential conflict.
Thanks, Hao Yao. And then a related one, that is the conflict of interest declaration and investigation to be incorporated as part of the audit committee or the risk committee, the sustainability committee, or which one?
Well, it typically depends on, first is it a whistleblower and a whistleblowing policy? If that happens, often it goes to either the governance or the audit committee. Often the audit committee is also the risk committee, especially, unless you're in a very large charity, typically they're the same. So I would say the audit committee, yeah.
How about Stephen? What are your thoughts? Anything you might want to add from a legal point of view?
Thank you, Stacey. As a start, I agree basically with what Prof. Ho and even Hao Yao have said about clear policies and procedures. They are very important. In fact, COI situations could crop up unexpectedly, and it is vital that they be managed. This is to maintain the trust and the confidence in the charity's stewardship. Coming to the Methodist Church, the Methodist Church is connectional. There are 40,000 members, 46 churches, 14 Methodist schools, and several ministry agencies. So the likelihood to have goods and services being provided by a Methodist member, family or friends of a Methodist member, is higher than average. In fact, Professor Ho's 6 handshake rule is very applicable here. So clear guidelines on related party transaction as part of the COI policy is needed. We have a rule book. It provides that such transactions are reviewed by the governance committee at church level and by the council of governance at HQ level. The reviews will ensure fairness and integrity in the procurement process. In some circumstances, there may be legal consequences if the policies and procedures are not in place and the decisions are not taken in the best interest of the charities. The board, the officers could be exposed to legal consequences. For example, contracts may be revisited or members liable to financial or other penalties. But much depends on the circumstances, the nature, and the extent of the conflict. Thank you, Stacey.
Thank you, Stephen. So now let's go on to the next question. How about Kok Leong? This is for you. You are in the sports sector, right? And in many NSA, National Sports Association, their board or EXCO may comprise of parents of athletes. How can these NSAs ensure or minimize potential conflicts of interest? Or are there other unique situations for the sports sector? Or what could be some of the best practices that you have observed?
Right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Stacey, for the question. Right. I think for national sports associations, I don't think only parents of athletes are involved. Basically, we in VAS, we do have board members who are owners of academies or clubs, right? So having said that, all these are kind of like a conflict to the board as well. So there are definitely pros and cons to this, right? And definitely it's not uncommon because the board need to make up of people with various capabilities and also expertise so that the board can function it properly, right? So having board members who are from the sport would definitely be valuable, right? As to know, they will know what the sport ecosystem is like and what is required and what is needed, right? And inevitably, they are also involved in the sport on a day-to-day basis. Then the question is how then we manage it effectively, right? So for VAS, right, like I mentioned earlier, there are board members who run private academies and clubs, right? So they definitely play a very crucial role in helping us understand the current situation on the ground. So we need these people around to be in the sport so that we are more connected, right? With the board members, also to the people on the ground, with parents, engagements, or even board members' engagement, right? So by doing so, these members also help us in identifying talents, right? Athletes, coaches, or even officials whom the sports association can also develop further for the betterment of the sport, right? We can get feedback from them and all that so that they can help to make certain collective decisions when coming to the benefits or the well-being of the whole association, right? So, but most importantly, in the board, right, we always look out for things such as whether money is involved, right, in their interest, or when they make certain decision, is this in favor of them, or whether they are business or clubs, or even as a parent, will they be putting anybody in an advantage position, and if VS were to implement certain decision on the ground, right? So our source of information cannot be from them alone, but we also have other board members who knows the fraternity well, right? This will also allow us to have more informed and well-rounded decision and make sound decisions subsequently, right? So in VAS, we do have our code of ethics, and the COI is part of the code of ethics. So for any board members that come on board, basically they need to declare their COI first. Do they own a club, or they are part of a academy that helps to run the sports in a way that it should be run, right? So, and I believe a lot of NSAs in Singapore do have their own COI policy as well. At the same time, not all NSAs are very encouraging towards parents' engagement, but they do set up a separate subcommittee, like to engage parents as a welfare. So they hear the voices on the ground, and then they take this decision making back to the board with a subcommittee per se. Right? So it will not be a direct influence to the board decision, or then they will eliminate some form of COI here. I hope I answered your question, Stacey.
Yes, that is very useful, especially those in the sports sector would benefit from your sharing.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott Leong. Prof Ho, I'm going to ask you a question, but before that, there's also a chat. There's a question in the chat as well, so I will put them together, right? So for the smaller charities, for example, some arts groups have employees serving on the board of those charities. For example, then the ED is a founder and is also the chairperson. In reality, they really, have to work all together as staff and board members, rolling up their sleeves, double hatting to do the work. So would this be considered a conflict of interest? Is this against the code of governance? Or what can these charities do to mitigate the risk that might arise due to the conflict of interest? And another question related in the chat is, right, donations for the board members to the charity is it considered as related party transaction?
Excellent question, right? Let me deal with the first one. I think we must be very clear, right? A purist will take a position absolutely zero conflict of interest. I think Stephen has put it well. If you do that for the Methodist Church, no business. you can't get things done, even though it's advantageous to the charities. So I think the corporate code of governance is very clear. We are not saying that there is no conflict of interest because we live in the real world as it is, right? So I think what we are advocating is basically, if there's a conflict of interest, it should be surfaced, and there should be open and transparent mechanism to deal with it, such that we're able to persuade people optically in reality that the best decision has been made for the charity, right? So if you use this as a framework and principle, if I'm the founder, if I'm the ED, right, and the best person to work in this particular circumstance has happened to be my niece, then the important thing is that I must not be the one making the decision. It must be an independent party that can make the decision. And we must also have some assurance that the independent party must be there enough to stand up to the ED and say, hey, she's not the best person, right? But unfortunately, in many times, this is not the case, right? So one school of thought is to, if we could avoid this, but another school of thought is that if there is enough check and balance within the systems, that's also, for example, let's take the simplest example. If the ED want to employ his niece to be the accountant, maybe the approving authority has go to the board, even though it is a so-called management decisions. In this instance, the ED sits at the top. They delegate it down to his deputy. There can be also a perception that the deputy may quite follow the ED. So you try to bring it up to next higher level, where in optics, the people say the chairman has done his due diligence, has checked with the HR manager, and look at the files of all the candidates, and that is the best person, and then so be it too. Right? I know it is very, very tough, and in some circumstances, sorry, tell charity, don't try that. It's too painful. You're going to justify their come home, right? Okay, so that is one thought factor, right? Your second question is always a puzzle to me as it is, right? I have come across financial statement in which the donation of the board members becomes a related party transaction. I have not sat down and asked my auditors why is this the case. Right? I mean, I would think that is it related party transaction? Normally is because the charity pays, right? Not when the charity receive money, so I find it very strange. I'll ask my auditor one day, see what they think, unless my panel has some thoughts, right? Any one of you, Stephen, Hao Yao, and Kok Leong? I come across it. I never had the trouble to ask the auditor why this is the case.
Yeah, I've seen both, but I don't think it's a problem either way, especially if it's a pure outright donation. But if it's a sponsorship, then I think it's a related party transaction. Donation, as you say, is received. There's no consideration returned to the individual. I don't see it as a problem or as a conflict.
Yes, I agree. As long as there are no strings attached.
Okay, so that immediately is a qualifier. So there's a difference, and the charity has to know very clearly the difference between a donation and a sponsorship. And if it's an IPC, the law enters the system because donation to an IPC is 250% tax deductions for the donors. But sponsorship, kosong, you just treat it as a business expense. Right? So charity and IPC must not be caught in this differentiation, because this pertains to the laws, right?
Thank you, Prof. Ho. So from Stephen and Hao Yao, any other real life examples? Anybody could go first that you like to share? Yeah.
First, I'll just share something quickly. I think the question of contractors is something that all charities face. And if it's a small project, particularly, you may not be able to find enough contractors at times. And so if you do know of contractors or board members know of contractors, should they recommend it? And I suppose it's the way you handle it, because the charity can benefit from good pricing, good quality contractors. So it's important then that the evaluation process done by the staff, there is no interference from the board member. It's a pure recommendation, and the rest of the handling should be by someone else. And it has to be by tender as well. So I think one of the examples Prof had earlier was, how do you know that it's the best price for that product that the board member was providing? And that can be solved through a tender process, a quotation process, or preferably everything's by open tender if the project is big enough. Because again, closed tenders, there's a question mark, right? It could be putting in just a few of the closed parties' names. So a contractor and supplier issues just have to handle the conflict properly. Like Alfo mentioned, entertainment. I probably wouldn't go out for lunch with anybody who's providing a service, and to just meet at the office or something above board and transparent. You don't want to end up with a close relationship, and then the charity may be worse off for it.
Thanks, thanks, Hao Yao. How about Stephen?
Thank you, Stacy. Just to add, for COI, for us, the very broad approach, like what Prof said, is to avoid in the first place. If not, you disclose, and other than that, you remove yourself from the decision-making process. On real-life example, I would like to share maybe from a different perspective. And what I share is not really a real-life example, but a real-life hypothetical example. Let's say we assume that a charity has a subsidiary providing services. And this subsidiary is very well known. But the charity decides, for reasons, to divest this business through an alternative business model. Full disclosure is made. Whole board concurs. Arrangements actually face a COI issue, but the affected persons would follow the proper footsteps, disclose, recuse, etc. However, the customers and potential customers who are stakeholders are not aware. So when these customers seek the services, it is because of this link with the charity. If later they find out that the subsidiary is the link from this enterprise, speculations will surely surface. There will be questions whether the COI policy has been adhered. There will be unnecessary speculations, whether there's a diversion of business. Therefore, I think what we need to be aware that the ramifications of any COI situation could extend beyond the board. So in such a situation, the board must also plan how to communicate this change also to the stakeholders. That is what I'd like to share. Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Stephen. Now, perhaps we would like to hear a little bit of comments or feedback. Let's launch a poll, then get some feedback from our audience, how they feel about the conflict regarding conflict of interest with the whistleblowing line. So may I request the poll for the conflict of interest whistleblowing line poll, please? While we are preparing for that, the poll to be launched. So there is a question: how do we handle a situation when we are aware that there was a breach of COI, and how do we rectify it without damaging the organization? So perhaps while the poll is going on, anybody would like to take on this question?
I answer a similar questions in a poll. I think sometimes these are the pains, especially when you're a new management, a new board, you found a skeleton in the closet. What do you then do? Right? Again, my thought pattern would be, I think it is always good to take out the skeleton, right, and address it whatever you can. Right? And I think one of the most important things is that if it's an illegal event or if there illegality, if there are fraud, this is the pain of the management and the board, that you will have to deal with the illegality. You can't cover it. But if it's not illegal, then you can look at what are how do you rectify it, right? Is that, I mean, if there's no proper declaration, then you can rectify your proper declaration. If it has been done wrongly, then you try to rectify it. My thought pattern will always be the fact that I think it is always good to take out the closet and clear it as it is. You see, in today's world, whistleblowing becomes a double-edged sword. All you need is a disgruntled employee who knows something about this and who leaves the organization or is disgruntled about the organization to blow the whistle to the authority. And this is even double jeopardy because then he can accuse the board and the management of cover-up. You know about it, but you chose not to do something about it. So this becomes a double jeopardy. You see what I mean, right? So I always speak with the board and management, and that's why I say I thank all of you for serving in the charity. It is an onerous task. Trust me, right? It's an onerous task, and for that I'm always grateful. You see what I mean, right? Thank you.
Thanks, Prof. Ho. Any comments from others? I'll just roughly share the results. So in terms of the whistleblowing mechanism, 13% finds it very effective. The 47 finds it effective. And then there's a 31% who actually have no comments or no experience or neutral about it. And there's a 9% who finds it ineffective. Right. Anybody would like to share your thoughts on this?
So maybe let me take a shot at this. You see, whistleblowing has found to be one of the most effective actually uncovering of fraud. In fact, it is well said now, external audit is the least effective, followed by internal audit, and then followed by whistleblowing. So this is where the new world is very different, I mean, right? So this is where I need to tell the governors and board, be very careful concerning any misdeeds or COIs or fraud, because someone can and will potentially blow whistle on you. So take note of that. You see, and that's why it is incumbent upon charity actually to seriously consider, and you should have, and not seriously, should have a dedicated whistleblowing policy. How do you allow people to tell you the things that's done wrongly? But once you do this, you have different sets of problems. What do you do with anonymous whistleblowing? What do you do with poison pen letter as it is? Right? So it takes a lot of efforts and time for the charity. But the unfortunate problem is the last thing you ever want is when the fraud is being discovered in the charity. Someone say, I wrote 3 letters to the management telling them about this fraud, but no one takes action on it. Then you have double jeopardy. Right? This is my view. What does the rest of panelists think in your experience of whistleblowing? However, and I has our fair share of whistleblowing.
Should I hear from Kok Leong about whistleblowing? You know, whether you find it, what is your thoughts on it?
Okay, I mean, personally, I have not experienced a lot of in NSA. We do not have a lot of whistleblowing. So I think I honestly think whistleblowing is like what Prof. Ho has said earlier. It could detriment the image of the organization and all that, right? If things are not done in a proper way and the correct way. But like also what Prof have mentioned earlier, the black and the gray, right? So it's difficult to move. It's difficult to eliminate COI definitely, but how we manage it and how we actually put a policy to it is, I think, is almost more important than anything else. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing, Kok Leong. And then this one is quite general. Anybody could take on, and actually it can be quite open question. How do we handle a situation when we are aware there's a breach of conflict of interest, and how do you rectify it without damaging the organization? So who would like to take on this question?
I think it's related to the previous question. What kind of remedial actions right? Again, this is the art part.
Mm.
Well, as Prof mentioned earlier, first, it's got to be, you make it above board. So what actually happened? Did one of the staff, for example, get a discount for some service from a supplier or contractor? And I've come across situations like that before, but inadvertently, right, without knowing. So it's simple. You bring it up, and as mentioned earlier, perhaps the audit committee, perhaps the whole board, and just to bring it out there's such a transaction. If it's too late to reverse it, then maybe you can always issue warning letters and say, well, this is a good example of what we shouldn't do, or if we do, there should be declaration or proper approval process. And it's quite a general question, so we're not sure you can, if it's an ongoing business contract and you discover that it's above market rate, well, it's a bit trickier because there's contractual terms, but we've tried to unwind it where possible. You know, that will be what I think.
Thanks, Hao Yao. How about any of our other panelists? Any comments on this regarding how we handle a situation when we're aware that there's a breach of COI, and how do we rectify it without damaging the organization?
I guess I mentioned earlier is to do it transparently as it is. I think the last thing you want to do is to bury it and assume that nothing has happened, right? I think you take it out, you just have to face the bull by the horn, is what I mean, right? And if it's wrong, you just have to ask people for forgiveness, instead of move on as it is. I saw in many of the chat about small charity. I must say that I am actually with you on small charity. A small charity is always very tough, right? You are already struggling just to have limited manpower, limited funds to dish out the services. Yet you have to have a tightly governance. So that is non-trivial as it is. And my suggestion will be, don't start every procedure brand new. Take the existing template, just copy them intelligently, and then start small. You don't have to have a full suite of an automated line for whistleblowing. You don't have to do that. You just have to start small to allow the various pieces, the processes to cascade upwards. Once an organization acquires a culture of integrity and trust, right? Some of these policies are just hygiene factor. They will likely not be used because the trust, the culture, the ethos of the organization permeates in all your work, right?
Thanks, Prof. And there is a question specifically for Kok Leong. So, given that the NSA board or MC is independent, how can the CEO or GM act as the whistleblower? To whom he or she report the COI breach to?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again, Stacey?
Certainly. So, given that the NSA board or MC is independent, how can the CEO or GM act as the whistleblower? To whom he or she report the COI breach to?
Okay, I think for our NSAs, I do agree that all of us are independent, right? I mean, so I think for the GM or for the CEO to report to, basically we will still trust the president of the board. Otherwise, we will go to the Secretary General to make the reporting body for any whistleblowing. Then I think then the board, I mean, so far we have done is the board will then decide how do we manage the whistleblowing, right? Because all of us are independent, but certainly the reporting goes to the president, or if not the SecGen.
So actually good questions, all right. Recently, I think in the audit committee, we had to revise our TOR and also look at whistleblowing. One of the question raised, if you have a whistleblowing against the AC chair, who do you whistleblow to? Because the whistleblowing goes to the AC chair, and then CC to the board chair. And then the next question asked is, if the whistleblowing is the board chair, who does it goes to? So I remember I had to talk to the board chair, and then we agreed. If the whistleblowing is against you, it comes to me. If it's against me, it goes to you. And then we make it clear in the policies. So in other words, technically speaking, there's a top And if the top is the problem, you have to create an alternative mechanism to go beyond the top. So there's accountability. It may never ever be triggered, but the mere fact of its existence tells the people that no one is above the laws, and no one is above the organization, no matter how high you are or what position you assume. Same thing with CEO, same thing with GM, and yada, down the whole chain of command. What do you think? Yeah.
Thanks. And then, there's another question. If past board minutes did not record COI action taken, is it recommended to rectify or just make sure it is written in moving forward? So yeah, last time was not done. So now how? Anybody likes to answer this question?
Well, clearly, as Prof said, you've got to bring the skeleton out of the closet. So definitely, just our procedure, you get it done. If it's something that happened already many years ago, can't do much about, it's just a learning point. As for the whistleblowing part, I have seen in other, organizations that the conflict tends to be more a staff grievance nature. So preferential treatment, for example, by the head of department or by the ED, saying that they hired old friends from their previous job, and if they give them a high grading and give them a bonus or a pay rise, and of course that's tricky. You basically have to go through the HR committee who has to look at this issue. But I think this tends to crop up from time to time because of staff grievance matters. It could be somewhat of a conflict in nature, and therefore we have these board committees to handle such issues.
Stacey, just let me share. For the Methodist Church, our whistleblowing policy goes beyond the conflict of interest. It covers all forms of unethical behavior. At the workplace, they cannot be reported through the normal reporting line. So in that sense, for us, grievances, we do not handle. It will be referred back to the human resource. Right, and just another thing to share, we view whistleblowing from a risk perspective, because if you have a clear procedure to report and investigate such misconduct, this will encourage persons to take this step rather than resort to the public forum to express the concerns. Then as the committee, we can then address these concerns and hopefully mitigate the prospects of the charity being exposed to negative publicity, or worse, to regulatory or criminal liability. And this could have a sort of a reputational or financial impact on us.
Thanks, Stephen. Okay, we have this time for one last question before we close this panel discussion. So, assuming that a person is a board member, and the board member sees a conflict of interest in the board, and I said, I don't want to manage this. Let me just resign from the board. What do you think?
This sounds like a listed company where the director say, independent director say, I resign. For what reason? Health reason. Right. Well, I am very sympathetic. You see, all of us are volunteers on the board. We're not here to make life difficult for people. We're not here to get angry. We're not here to have a fight too. Right? I think I'm on a human perspective. Yes, it's very reasonable that I don't want to deal with this problem. I resign. So be it too. Well, unfortunately, maybe this is where the Commission of Charity has set up a mechanism to interview these people and say, why do you resign? I don't know. Listed company, they have this mechanism to do so. But I think maybe the board member should also try and say, appeal to people who are sensible, because the problem lies in if you resign, that conflict of interest can ultimately end up in winding up the whole charity, right? See, then literally the damage done is much more. So again, I appeal back to the peoples in terms of their sense of rightness, their courage, and also their willingness to stick to it. I mean, I am sure there will be a listening ears to deal with conflict of interest. I'm sure at the end of the day, justice will be done. All right, so, but it's a matter of hanging in there. That's my view. What does the rest of y'all think? I'm optimistic.
Well, yeah, of course, if there's a big meaty contract that a board member is benefiting from, then some of the other directors may think, I'm just here to rubber stamp and to help enrich this board member. So I mean that's understandable, but not to encourage board revolt or anything. But there are also other independent members on the board who are not in this transaction or in this conflict, and they should also bring it up for discussion, because after all, the conflicted person has to recuse, right? So they can always bring it up and make some decisions regarding this transaction. It could be just terminated after this contract ends, or and so forth. So there could be some remedial actions that could be done. Resigning is, of course, last resort. You're elected member of the board, and there's some obligation to serve out your term. And if you do find something wrong, the responsibility is to bring it up rather than to resign.
Thanks, Hao Yao. How about Stephen Kok Leong?
I agree with Hao Yao, because if you are elected, just because you know of something, you resign, does not really exonerate you from your responsibility. Right. So the thing is how to deal with it. Like what Professor Ho said, I try to think of a sort of a diplomatic kind of approach to try and resolve this, rather than just resign.
Thanks. You have the privilege of having the last comment, Kok Leong.
I think I also do agree with them on with Hao Yao, and I think resigning is always the easiest way out to avoid a problem, right? But that does not do any good to the organization, right? If everybody sees it as a conflict of interest, and I choose to shy away from the problem, and I choose not to be involved at all, then I think there's many ways to approach it. I think we can set different tiering. Whoever that is involved be excused or from making a decision, and then leave it to other independent members to make such decision as well. So I think resigning, before we come on board to any organization, I think there is certain obligation that we need to fulfill, right? I think we need to manage it properly and in more transparent manner.
I have received a request. So, before we close off this the panel discussion, right? Can each of you, give us your, precious advice regarding CY?
Okay, let me start the ball rolling. Mine's a simple one. When in doubt, declare. So I just share a story. I remember when I started in the board, I wasn't very sure. So this board was in the process of approving a proposal. So when a proposal came, I said, hey, I know this guy. So out of enthusiasm, I said, hey, there's a conflict. But they told me, just because you know someone doesn't mean there's a conflict. So, but the thing is that when you are in doubt, just declare. So there's advice for all of you.
Thank you, Stephen. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think for anything that you do, right, if you just have slightest doubt of whether a COI involved, just inform your board that I'm actually doing this. Like for example, myself, right, I deal with athletes. We travel overseas, and I'm in the financial sector. So people come to me, hey, Kok Leong, where do we get a travel insurance for the athlete, and how are we going to manage that? I say, okay, I do have contacts, but you deal directly with. I will not be involved in the discussion, and I will not be CC in any of the discussion with the particular person. So I think you just have to make your stand very clear, and also recuse yourself from making decision as such if you think that there is a conflict of interest.
I'll let Prof have the last word. So, if there are not enough conflict of interest examples, thank goodness, in the newspaper about charities, do look at the listed company space. For example, recently there are a few companies who were called out for employing and paying number of family members of the major shareholder. So it could be legitimate, but of course there's some reputational issues, and whether all the documentations were properly done up or not, something that remains to be seen. One of the companies was as a result of a whistleblower as well. So there's something interesting in that space, and there's always something happening in listed company space, and a lot of them have very good learning examples and parallels in what you do on the board and in the charity. So good place to look out for.
My words will be, I think the world has changed. I think the charity of my father's time and the charity of my time is very different. I think in the good old days, being a charity on the board of charity is glamorous, right? And in fact, almost all the successful businessmen are on the charity of one way or another. But in today, I think we need to understand, being on the board of charity comes with its significant responsibilities, right? So I think we really need to retool ourselves. We really need to take our role very much more seriously, because I'll share with you honestly, I think as someone on the charity sector, some of my nightmare is that my entire life and reputation can be ruined by one charity. All right, if I'm a bit careless, or if I didn't do my work properly. And sometimes I sit down and wonder, do I really want to do that with my life? But I guess the thought pattern is that I think we owe an obligation, right, to serve the charity, to serve the community that we have benefited from. So I like always to end this thought pattern is that I want to come back to the thought that I really want to thank all of you for serving on this charity, right? Your work, your efforts. I don't know how it can be ever rewarded, but I think that the best reward we can ever have is that we see lives being benefited. We see the world a better place in the small little corner that we've been placed to serve, right? So for COI, it's not easy. I like Stephen say, be open, be transparent. If there is nothing evil about it, we don't have to worry about it. In fact, one of the famous judges says this: sunlight is the best disinfectant. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. Make use of the sunlight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, the panelists. We have now come to a close of the panel discussion. This has been a very interactive and engaging session through the chats, through discussion, and I'd like to thank our attendees for active participation and our panelists for your thoughtful perspectives and sharing. One of the questions earlier was asking for resources, so we will be sharing one of the templates as well as the code of governance with you. So for those questions that we are unable to answer all, feel free to write to CNPL. Then we could address, see how we could help you or address and have a deeper conversation with you. I shall now hand over to Mr. Kixon Lee, Head of CNPL, to deliver the closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Very good afternoon, fellow leaders. And I would like to echo the words of Prof. Ho. Thank you so much for stepping up, for our charities as well as for the beneficiaries and the clients. So board members and staff should act in the best interest of charity. And this topic of conflict of interest is a very, very real topic, especially when most of us volunteer on several boards of charities. And as leaders, we are often challenged by many fronts to make decisions, and ethical ones. So really, really from the bottom of our hearts, a very big thank you to Prof. Ho for sharing with us insights this morning. Our panelists, Hao Yao, Stephen, and Kok Leong, for taking time off this morning to join us on this panel and this Board Connect webinar. So fellow leaders, actually, this is our 10th and final Board Connect webinar for 2021. So on behalf of the team at the Center for Nonprofit Leadership, we thank you all for your support. We will continue to work even harder to bring you more relevant topics in 2022. So please feel free to share with us topics that really matter to you, topics that you're really interested in, passionate in, and we will bring these topics to you. Do also look out for our third and final leadership conversation on November 19. It is on active ages in leadership. And joining us as a keynote and special guest for that leadership conversation will be ESM Goh Chok Tong. So once you receive the invitation, please remember to register, as seats are really, really limited for this conversation. Before I end off this session, I also like to invite all charities to feel free to approach the team at CMPL for all your board advisory matters, including finding board members for your charities. And that is very important. All right. So as a shared services partner of the charities unit, we are there for you and we are committed to journey with you towards more excellence and governance. Well, as we know, we are slowly moving and transiting into the endemic phase, and we hope to be able to reconnect and to meet you all face to face with safe management measures in place, of course. So with this, I wish you all the best. Please continue to stay well and stay safe. Over to you, Stacey.
Thank you, everyone. I wish you a very good afternoon. And thank you once again for participating.